sounds like Harry Potter, but it's not. It's a lot darker. It's not a school for witchcraft and wizardry. It's a school for hunting and murdering and learning how to kill people. Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Kizzy and today I'm going to be doing an ultimate guide to Grimdark Fantasy. Grimdark Fantasy has kind of become my new favourite genre recently. All the fantasy books that I'm reading at the moment seem to fit into this genre and be incredible. Anything that's kind of not in this genre just a little bit lackluster for me at the moment. So it's definitely my grimdark phase, which is kind of a weird phase to be in because it's dark and grim, but it is a good one. I like it. I'm gonna stand with it for as long as possible. So I'm gonna split this video into kind of like subsections. So the first thing I'm gonna discuss is kind of what is grimdark fantasy, what it means, what is it as a genre compared to like normal fantasy or like your typical hero fantasy and epic fantasy. And then I'm gonna go into kind of like more recommendations. So starting off with kind of like what's the stereotypical, like I've called it classic. I've got one example of like a classic pioneering genre defining book that everyone loves that you will know what it is. Then I go into kind of more introductory reads, so if you've never like dipped your toe into this genre before or perhaps you don't know where to start with reading this genre, I've got a couple of recommendations for you for that. And then more, I've labelled it as like kind of advanced grimdark fantasy, but obviously you can read this at any stage. They're just the more kind of violent, much darker side of grimdark fantasy, where there's a lot of like blood and gore, and it does kind of it's just the darker end of the genre, which I mean it's quite a dark genre anyway, that's kind of what it is. I mean you can start with these books. There's by no means do you have to like not read these if you've never read the genre before. You might have already read them and not even realise that they fit into the genre. But then I have for the final category ones that are on my TBR. So they're books that have been recommended to me that I've seen on like social media and online and booktube and blogs that I want to read, that I even have on my shelf, just haven't got around to doing it. So I'm recommending them to you as books that you could read if they appeal to you, but I can't personally recommend them because I haven't read them yet. Also down below, like I've listed a few of the websites that I've used to come up with like the definition for grimdark. They've also got their own recommendations on there. So if you want more, or like just to know a little bit more, like a kind of another like take on the genre, have a look at those. They'll be helpful resources for you. So starting off with what is grimdark fantasy. If you've never heard of the term before, it is kind of self-explanatory. It's grim and it's dark. It's kind of a tonal thing for a lot of people. Like a lot of people define it as something that is got a darker tone to it. It's kind of got that hopeless element to it where everything is quite down. There's an apocalyptic element to the worlds, so the worlds themselves tend to be on the end of destruction. Either the war's destroyed the world and everything's hopeless, the war is about to begin and everything is hopeless. That kind of like everything is destroyed or being destroyed in that current moment. Unlike typical hero kind of epic fantasy, it's unlikely that you're definitely going to be guaranteed a good ending. Most likely you're not going to be guaranteed a good ending. But the other side of like grimdark fantasy, obviously you have the violence of it as well. A lot of them are pretty violent. Some of the most disturbing scenes that I've ever read in books are in these books that I'm going to be recommending to you today. So just be wary of that if you are after any kind of trigger warnings. Do check most of these books before you dive into them. And I'll go into all the ones that I'm talking about, but like you have squashed eyeballs, you have heads being physically crushed and descriptions of gore going everywhere, and you have like genocides described in detail, those kind of things. So like they are heavy reads, they're not like summer like reads for holiday. The other side of grimdark fantasy though, which is the bit that I kind of like the most, they tend to kind of focus more on the realistic nature of people and characters. With heroes and that kind of thing, they have especially in fantasy, they have the unrealistic element that everything will be okay. The characters don't have that much kind of agency almost. They're kind of set on a pretty rigid tracks of they're put down, they discover some kind of journey, there's like some evil dark force, normally in the person like a single figure or a single kind of entity, and they must defeat this person and then come out the hero at the top. Grimdark fantasy doesn't tend to have that element of, or that guarantee that the hero is going to come out on top, or if they are going to come out on top, that they're going to be this amazing super person that you're going to like admire. Grimdark fantasy is the genre for grey characters and flawed hero. A lot of them are flawed, incredibly so. Like you will read these books and you're like, why am I rooting for this character? They've just done the most horrific things ever, but somehow you're still on their side. It's a very strange time to be in. It's great. So they definitely go into more of the kind of psychological effect of war. Some fantasies especially, I mean most most adult fantasies will, if they're good, I would say, will dip into the psychological effects if they've got war in them. War and fighting is kind of a trademark of fantasy. They should kind of dip into the psychological effect of murdering someone repeatedly and being exposed to this gore. Grimdark Fantasy just takes that to the end and really kind of looks at the psychological effect and how it can really mess a person up. These people will not be squeaky clean at the end of it. They won't ever be that kind of person. They will be messed up. They will be mentally hindered by the fact that they've had to be in wars. They've seen all these gruesome things. They've had to do terrible, terrible things to get the results that they need to save the world. Whether or not it's saved at the end is arguable a lot of the time, you know, so that is kind of like the element of it. If you like morally grey characters and debating on whether or not characters are good or bad, do actions justify the means, etc., it's the genre for you. So Grimdark has that kind of much more realistic approach to fantasy. You know, it takes away a little bit of that shiny, exciting magicness of how incredible fantasy can feel sometimes, and really throws you into the realities of what the world is like. So you tend to not have amazing kings and queens that just are like all lovey-dovey and amazing because they're kings and queens. Like the monarchies tend to be pretty crap, or the governments or the ruling people tend to be pretty crap, and your heroes aren't heroes basically. You could easily flip a lot of these books on their heads and write the heroes as the villains easily. Like most of the time, I mean, you could probably just assume that they are actually kind of villainous, but they're very clever in the way that they write them that you don't actually see them as the villain. Unless you don't like the genre, actually. I have talked about a few of these books with people that just don't like grimdark fantasy, and that's because the characters a lot of the time are incredibly unlikable and are very easy to argue as to why you won't like them, because they are horrible people a lot of the time and they do terrible things. There you go. I don't know if that was a great explanation, but that's kind of what grimdark fantasy is. It's very dark. The tone is dark. The events that occur are dark, and they don't tend to shy away from descriptions of violence. The hero kind of psychological effect, I think, is the main takeaway, or the main consistent thing that you'll find throughout these, because there are books on here that like are classified as grimdark, but they don't always have all these elements to them. And as a genre anyway, you'll look online, it is incredibly debated whether or not books fit into the character debated. It has changed, I think, a lot throughout the time it's been a genre. Publishing also try and put books in the genre that you would not necessarily put in that genre. A lot of these books that I'll be recommending, some people might disagree with me, but I think they have the elements to them and could be argued to be a grimdark fantasy. Starting on with the classic of the genre, and one that kind of, I suppose, I'm giving to ground it for people that don't really know much about it, as I feel like most people will either have watched the show or read the books or know some element of it, and that is obviously Game of Thrones. As someone that has not read the book and only watched a couple of the seasons years ago and actually didn't enjoy it, someone that loves reading fantasy, watching it is not always my favourite thing, just because I just know that the books are better. So a lot of the time I don't love watching it. I think it's a lot harder to get the image of a fantasy book on the TV screen, just because obviously it is fantasy, it's made up. You can't really do a lot of it in real life. Game of Thrones, I mean, some websites said it was like pioneering of the genre. So like it's got that darkness, it's got those morally grey characters that you still root for, even though you're constantly kind of questioning why the heck are you liking this character. It's got the violence aspect to it, it's got the dark tone, it's got that kind of hopelessness to it that would classify it as a grimdark fantasy. So if you kind of think along Game of Thrones vibes for when you're thinking of grimdark and what fits into the genre, there you go. I'm not going to talk about that much because I don't actually know a lot about Game of Thrones, but that kind of just a grounding base for you. The next books I'm going to recommend are what I would perhaps start your journey with in the grimdark fantasy. If you've never been in the genre before and you're not sure if you're gonna like it, I would start with these ones, because the other ones can be so heavy that actually it might put you off the genre if you're going from a super light, fun, adventure fantasy into these much darker fantasies. So the first one I have is the 5th season series or trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I've read the first 2 in these, and they're kind of, I suppose, sci-fi crossover. I think they can cross over into the 2 genres, but they are dark. The characters are questionable. It's apocalyptic in the fact that the whole world is being destroyed. There's not necessarily any great antagonist that they must defeat, or not obvious like kind of single person that is their enemy. One of the main characters does do some very questionable things and is definitely a grey character. So for the synopsis of the 5th season, you're basically in this world where there's been this big earthquake. The world is shifting, it's destroyed a lot of the civilization. This seems to happen on a reoccurring event. You're following Essen, who whose husband has murdered their son, I believe, and is on the run. She is now kind of trying to find him whilst this kind of apocalyptic event is happening. Then you also have, oh, I've just remembered the ending. That's why it's, yeah, okay. So obviously I'm not going to tell you the ending, but the ending definitely kind of solidifies this as a grimdark fantasy, because our main character, she does something very questionable, just wrong, just downright wrong. Like, it's just not a good thing that she does. But there you go. There, yeah. So yeah, but it's got a very dark atmosphere and tone to it, obviously. But there's three. I think there's three storylines going through this. You've got Essen, who is obviously chasing after her husband, who's murdered their son. You've then got a younger girl who's living in these schools. So the magic system's kind of weird in this. There's like these magic beings, but they're kind of being trained in this school. So you've got that groundworks, but these people are actually kind of like hated in the society. That's why they're taken and put in these schools, otherwise they'd be killed. And there is a third storyline, but I can't remember it, so this is a terrible synopsis. But there you go. I read it like 2 or 3 years ago now, to be fair. So yes, but it's not quite as violent. It is violent, but the descriptions of the violence aren't so heavy that you're not gonna be able to eat your lunch. It's more focused definitely on the morality side of the decisions rather than going headfirst into these descriptions. So that's why I put it in as a beginner one, because it's very good for seeing the moral side of it, the questionable actions, the tone, all those kind of things. It just doesn't have the physical descriptions of the violence that might put some people off. The next one is one that when researching it, like when I read this, I would not have put it in the genre, but upon researching it and like seeing some people's reasonings as to why it is a grimdark fantasy, I can see it, and that's kind of maybe why I've put it in this category of like a beginner or like a first dip in the toe. Dip in the toe? Toe in the dip? No, dip into the genre. Don't know what happened there. This book is the Assassin's Apprentice like epic long series of multiple trilogies in one by Robin Hobb. So you've got the Farseer trilogy, which is the first one. This follows Fitz, who is a young boy who's the bastard child of the up-and-coming king, the prince. He will be king, basically. He never actually meets his dad because his dad decides to abdicate of the kind of humiliation of fathering a bastard child. So his next brother is like the next in line. It's the only one that kind of fatherly figure that Fitz really has, plus obviously the king, who's his like grandfather. Not the best role models, obviously. They want to keep him close because he is obviously part of the royal blood, but he is not legitimate, so he will never be kind of like, he's a threat, but he's not royal. So to keep him close and kind of in the family and like in the ways of the royal family, they decide that actually they'll train him as an assassin so that he can go places that royals can go, but not in the way that royals go. That doesn't make much sense. So basically, as a bastard child, he will still be kind of able to go to different kingdoms and see different like kings and queens and have that prestige about him, but he won't be kind of looked at royalty and treated as royalty. He won't have that kind of pressure. He has the freedom instead to go off and murder people. So obviously that's the kind of moral side of it. Like, you've got this young boy being trained to kill people, and he has to kind of go through a very big development as to whether or not he wants to kill these people, and if this is the right or wrong thing, because this is what he's been told to do by his family. It's good for the kingdom needs it, but is it good for him? Is any kind of murder good just because it's for the greater people? These kind of the questions that you've got in this book. You've obviously got a lot more to it as well. The magic system is a lot to do with like animals and communicating with animals and all that kind of thing. I've read the first 2 books again in this series. I haven't read the third one. I do want to continue on. Actually, I think I want to reread the second one first, but then I will want to continue on with it. But this one is definitely more focused on the moral side. It does have a darker tone. I don't think it's the darkest tone. You have an element of romance in there as well, which a lot of these fantasies you don't, or if you do, that they're just kind of downright depressing. So it is a lighter side of the dark moral compass. I wouldn't say there's that much violence in it, at least not the bits that I've read so far. Yeah, again, it doesn't really have the violent side of it, just the moral compass discussions and experiments, I suppose. That's another one I think that if you like that side of it, if you don't like the violent side of grimdark fantasy, but you want morally grey characters, this is the perfect book, because you don't have that, but you can still really enjoy the book. I know people that hate like these heavy ones that I've got coming up next, but love this series. So the next ones I have for you are 3 books that I'd say are kind of the more gruesome, darker side of Grimdark Fantasy. I've got one on here that maybe is questionable. I read an article that said it wasn't, but their reasoning for why it wasn't was, I think, ridiculous. So I'm putting it on here. So we're going to start off with a book that I recently read and absolutely loved, or trilogy, and that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is the darkest book that I think I've ever read, ever. I don't like watching reviews before I read the books, which I know is kind of counterproductive maybe, but I think there's so much. I mean, I briefly read a couple synopsises and briefly look at a couple comments, but I don't like to know in detail things, what people have said about this. So I don't know if people just don't say in like brief synopsises how dark this is, but I had kind of no idea how gruesome it was before going into it. You've got full on like entire civilizations and cities brutally murdered, and the aftermath is described in detail in this. Rin, our main character, is the most questionable character ever. Like, what, in the end, like the 3rd book, she does stuff that is so bad that you're just like, what the heck is going on here? Honestly, she just, like, I can't describe it because I'll spoil it, but the things and the choices that she makes to get to her ultimate objective, which in itself by the end isn't even kind of like a good objective anymore. Like, she's just lost her way a little bit. Like, she's been so focused on getting to this point that she's lost her way basically. So she goes down the darkest hole in the world and just keeps going, you know. She just keeps digging, but it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Like, I could not put this down. It was like watching the worst car crash ever, and still I could not put, like, I just couldn't draw my eyes away from it. I read this trilogy in like, I think it was like 2 months in the end, but like I haven't done that in a trilogy in so long. Like, as I said with the other ones, like I always read one book here, one book there, one book there. I marathoned this just because it was just absolutely addictive. But you have, yeah, it's just got every kind of element of Grimdark Fantasy. The tone gets darker as it goes on, but it's already quite dark. Like, we begin the story with Rin, who is an orphan of the previous war, previous Poppy War. Was it Poppy War? I don't know. The previous war. She's an orphan, so she's been adopted, or forcibly kind of like by the government adopted into this family that sell drugs and sell opium, and she's like kind of a drug runner for them. Then she ends up getting into this military school. That's kind of, we got a little bit of a lull in the darkness. It's kind of a little bit lighter, a bit funnier. We meet some of the other main characters that are going to be throughout the trilogy, her friend and her rival. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's a complicated relationship, that one. We meet all the other characters, and then halfway through is kind of where you get the split. The war starts basically. The world is about to end. Everything is a disaster. Part of the genre kicking in. She has to go to war. And I think, she's only like 16 or 17 at the time. Like, she's very young still, and is exposed to all these horrific sights and decision-making processes. Just a lot of mental strain goes on her and the characters. And she fully dives into how that affects someone. Like, they are so messed up, these characters. And R.F. Kuang does an amazing job going into that and showing the realities of what you would be like if you had to do what these characters have done and experience what they've experienced. So honestly, yeah, an incredible book, an incredible series. Would highly recommend, if you do want to kind of go for a darker book, that you start with this one. Actually, you could start with anyone, but this one is good. So the next one I have is one that is grimdark. It's got that dark tone, but it's also got a little bit more humor in it than your typical grimdark fantasy, shall we say? And that is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. If you watched any of my recent videos, you'll know I love this dude. The Blade Itself is kind of hard to explain what it is. I'll try and do it briefly. We have 3 or 4 kind of main characters. We've got Logan, who is your kind of thinking back to Viking, ruthless, brutal, almost barbarian-esque society that he comes from. How he solves problems is like that. He's trying to change though. He's trying to go on the righteous path, be a better person, and not the Bloody Nine is what his like known name is in the North. Obviously, murder is allowed in their society. It's how they solve issues, and if you are the brutalist murderer, you are the best. So he is the best in the North, basically. Beginning of the book though, he somehow finds himself not in the North, and he comes into the South. In the South, we've got a few more characters. We've got Giselle, who is the pompous, idiot of the book, but he is hilarious. He thinks he's the absolute bee's knees and is incredible and amazing and has this very luxurious life of just rolling around doing whatever he wants, playing card games, drinking, sleeping with whoever he wants, having this kind of like luxurious life. Then we have Farah, who is on a revenge pact basically. She's from the very south. Her family was murdered by the Gurkish, which I suppose is the dark entity in this one. Are they a country? I think they're a country who are trying to take over the area that all our main characters are currently in. So that's like part of the war that's going on. There's also a war in the north as well. Lots of wars going on, you know, end of the world, apocalyptic, everything's about to fall apart kind of vibe. She's on an revenge pack to kill all the Gurkish because they killed and murdered her family and made her a slave. Then you have Glokta, who was kidnapped by the Gurkish in the first war, pre to this book happening. He was tortured and kept in captivity and is now a cripple and kind of mentally affected by this horrific time that he went through. As a kind of repercussion of that, I suppose, he is now an inquisitor, so he does the same thing to other people now. He now not kidnaps, but he takes people in, he tortures them and gets real or non-real confessions out of them, just whatever his government need at the time. So that's his role. Then we kind of have a found family thing going on. Farah, Giselle and Logan all go on a quest with this wizard dude called Bayars, who, he's another dude, don't really like him, but you know, he's involved. They go on a quest, they have a found family kind of thing. That's a nice aspect to it. And then Glokta obviously is very questionable with what he does, being an inquisitor and all these kind of like brutal things that he does to get things, but you also root for him as well. He's very funny, he's very sarcastic, and his like a view on the world is quite not enjoyable to read. It is enjoyable, but it shouldn't be. That's what a lot of these books are like. You shouldn't enjoy reading these, but you just do. Maybe that says more about your personality than you kind of want to think about, but there you go. So yeah, this is just another great series to get into. He has a lot of books in this world. I would just highly recommend getting involved. So the third and final book that I have in this one is one that, again, online people were kind of disagreeing of whether or not it fit into the genre. It possibly goes more into the paranormal horror side of the fantasy genre. I think that can also be grimdark. I mean, you might disagree with me, but that is The Empire of the Vampire by J. Christoph. So this is quite an epic book. 800 plus pages, but it is dark. There is not a lot of hope. Well, there is, but then that's destroyed drastically, and it will make you cry. I sobbed at this book because all the hope and love and joy that you had is destroyed. And it's awful. Well, it's not awful, it's incredible. I would say it was dark. You've got violence in there, you've got a definite dark tone. This is not your airy fairy glittery fantasy. You know, there's no sparkling people in this one. These vampires are the antagonist people, so I suppose you have that driving force. Our hero is meant to be a hero, but he's not, or at least he doesn't want to be. Does he do questionable things? I can't really remember. So maybe it is more of a hero, I don't know. But there is violence in it, like there's quite gruesome aspects to it, and it is just dark. So this book follows Gabriel de Leon. Did you like my pronunciation there? No idea if it was right. And he is a half human, half vampire. Those people that are half human, half vampire become vampire hunters. Again, you've got this post-apocalyptic world where vampires have become the ruling people. They've destroyed human civilization. It's dark all the time. There's no sunlight anymore. So now that there is no sunlight, they can just roam all the time, and they do, and they have destroyed human civilization. So they've had to create these against forces to kill the vampires, but the only people that can kill the vampires are vampires themselves, or like, you know, half vampires that have this kind of abilities to tackle these superhuman beings. As a half human, half vampire, he's also kind of considered half a monster. So he's rejected by human civilization, rejected by the vampires, because obviously he's, you know, trying to kill them. But they are all taken into this thing, and half the book is from his youth when he is learning to be a vampire hunter in this kind of school. Sounds like Harry Potter, but it's not. It's a lot darker. It's not a school for witchcraft and wizardry. It's a school for hunting and murdering and learning how to kill people. Then you have his later on life where they're trying to find the goblet. It's like what's that thing? The Holy Grail, which will apparently kill all the vampires. So he's on this hunt for that, but for some reason he doesn't want to be there. There's something that's happened between this point and the other point in his life that's turned him into a much darker, more pessimistic, hopeless character. And then finally you kind of in the present day where you have Gabriel de Leon telling this story to the vampire that has captured him and has him in captivity. He's also addicted to blood. Obviously, to have the strength, they have to have blood, but it's obviously a very looked down upon practice, if not a necessary one. And he is addicted to this, and that's kind of how he's manipulated by the vampire into telling the story. So you have a lot of heavy themes in there, you have a lot of heavy events happening. It's just an incredible book though. So good, like there is quite brutal scenes in it that will break your heart, but honestly it's incredible. It's one of the best books that I've ever read. It's one of my favourite books of all time. Would highly recommend it. Even if you don't think it doesn't 100% fit into the genre, but it has elements of it that I think it's worth mentioning in this video. So for the final aspect of this video, I've got 3 books here that I don't own all of them, but are on my radar for my reading escapades and that have been highly recommended online and in other videos that I feel comfortable enough to tell you about them and think that you would like them as well if you have read any of these books or are interested in any of these books. So the first one that I have is by Scott Lynch, and this is The Lies of Locke Lamora. I'll read you the synopsis. The Thorn of Camor is said to be an unbeatable swordsman, a master thief, a friend to the poor, a ghost that walks through walls. Slightly built and barely competent with a sword, Locke Lamora is, much to his annoyance, the fabled Thorn. And while Locke does indeed steal from the rich, who else would be worth stealing from, the poor never see a penny. All of Locke's gains are strictly for himself and his tight-knit band of thieves, the gentleman's bastards. The capricious, colourful underworld of the ancient city of Camor is the only home they've ever known, but now a clandestine war is threatening to tear it apart. Caught up in a murderous game, Locke and his friends are suddenly struggling to stay alive. So obviously, even from that synopsis, you can tell that it's a grimdark fantasy. You've got the apocalyptic world brewing on the horizon. You've got questionable morals from the characters. Swordsman, well, I mean, he says he's not very competent with the sword, so I don't know if it's got the violent descriptive aspect of it. That's the only thing I can't guarantee or comment on since I haven't read it myself. It's a found family grimdark thing going on. I think it's actually meant to have quite a lot of humour in it as well, which from, again, the blurb you can kind of tell. So I'm very excited. I've got this one and the second one. Oh no, I don't. I have the third one. I need to get the second one. I was sent this one very kindly, so I need to get the second one so that I have the whole set. The next one I have is another one that came up a lot as kind of like a pioneering book for the genre, and that's Mark Lawrence's The Prince of Thorns. Also my colleague's like one of her all-time favourite books, so I am very confident that a lot of people love this book. I have his Red Sister series, which is an odd duology, which is another grimdark fantasy. I mean, like, the cover is pretty grim anyway, but I actually don't know what the Prince of Thorns is about. I should have looked that up before. So I'll just read you the Goodreads synopsis for this. I might have to bring it closer because I have terrible eyesight. So, before the Thorns taught me their sharp lessons and bled weakness from me, I had but one brother, and I loved him well. But those days are gone, and what is left in them lies in my mother's tomb. Now I have many brothers, quick with knife and sword and as evil as you please. We ride this broken empire and loot its corpse. There you go, corpses mentioned already. They say these are violent times, the end of days, post-apocalyptic violence, when the dead roam and monsters haunt the night. All that's true enough, but there's something worse out there in the dark, much worse. From being a privileged royal child raised by a loving mother, Georg Ancrath has become the Prince of Thorns, a charming, immoral boy leading a grim band of outlaws. Even got the word grim in there. In a series of raids and atrocities. Oh, the world is in chaos, violence is rife, nightmares everywhere. Georg has the ability to master the living and the dead, but there is still one thing that puts chill in him. Returning to his father's castle, Georg must confront horrors from his childhood and carve himself a future with all hands turned against him. So there you go. Got a lot of elements of grimdark in there. But it sounds, it sounds good. It's on my radar to read. I might start obviously with the duology since it's what I have with me. But his debut is The Prince of Thorns, and that's, I think, probably his most successful book. It did come out like a long time ago, so 2011? Is that a long time ago now? Does that count? Did it really come out then? Well, I don't know if it's pioneering then. Maybe it's just like a great example of the genre. So then the final one I have to recommend is another one that I've seen mainly on social media, to be honest. Wasn't really on many of the articles that I read. That is Gideon and the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This I think is more of a kind of sci-fi grimdark. Again, I'm going to read you the synopsis just because I feel like that's probably the more concise way instead of me trying to rambly put together a synopsis of a book I don't really know much about. The Emperor needs necromancers. The 9th necromancer needs a swordswoman. Gideon has a sword, some dirty magazines, and no more time for undead bullshit. Brought up by unfriendly, ossifying nuns, ancient retainers, and countless skeletons, Gideon is ready to abandon a life of servitude and an afterlife as a reanimated corpse. What? Gideon is ready to abandon a life of servitude and an afterlife as... Is she a corpse? Maybe she's a corpse. How fancy. She packs up her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines and prepares to launch her daring escape, but her childhood nemesis won't set her free without a service. Harrow Hark Nonagesimus, Reverend daughter of the 9th house and Bone Witch extraordinaire has been summoned into action. The Emperor has invited the heirs of each of his loyal houses to a deadly trial of wit and skill. If Harrow Hawk succeeds, she will become an immortal, all-powerful servant of the resurrection, and no necromancer can ascend without their cavalier. Without Gideon's sword, Harrow will fail and the 9th house will die. Of course, some things are better left dead. I had no idea that was what that was about. Not gonna lie, probably should have read that before. Not that it makes a difference, it's still kind of apparently Grimdark Fantasy. I mean, you've got necromancers in there. Whether or not it's got the kind of moral side of it, don't know. Don't know what these dirty magazines are that she's talking about, seems a bit spicy. But it's probably got the violent aspect to it, I'm gonna say. She's got that sword on the cover and dead people, which is pretty grim. So there you go. I'm gonna round this video up because it's apparently very long. Thank you again for watching. I hope this has been helpful. I've enjoyed it. I love these books. This is my favourite genre, I think, at the moment, and all time it probably will be for a very long time. So I will do more as I read more in the genre, and maybe do like a highlights, although to be fair, I did talk about most of my favourite in the genre anyway. So this is kind of a highlights reel anyway. But yes, thank you for watching. If you did enjoy the video, do remember to like and subscribe. It does really help me and my channel and making these videos. And I will hopefully see you in the next video very soon. Do we have like, what's it called? When you have like, what is it called? Like not ghosts, but like, I don't know what it's called. Never mind.
A few moments later.
Necromancer, that's what I was trying to think of.